My name is Renee. I'm 36, and 3 weeks after my husband's Mistress opened her restaurant, a courier arrived there with a certified letter from a bank's legal department, in the middle of a Saturday lunch service. I wasn't in the room when it happened. A friend who still had a reservation there sent me a video afterward, filmed quietly from her table. The restaurant's manager reading the letter once, then again, then walking to the register, and simply turning the card machine off while half the tables still had customers mid-meal, plates only partly cleared. Nobody explained anything to the guests. The manager just stood there, holding a piece of paper, looking like someone had rearranged the floor underneath her without warning. The letter declared a $340,000 home equity loan void, effective immediately, with all disbursed funds subject to recall. That loan had paid for the restaurant's kitchen equipment, its walk-in cooler, its first month of payroll, 3 weeks earlier. It had been taken out against my house, the one I inherited from my mother, the one held solely in my name, the one my husband had no ownership interest in whatsoever. To understand how a bank could undo $340,000, 3 weeks after handing it over, I need to take you back 7 years, to a hospital room, and a document I signed half-conscious that I completely forgot existed until the day it was quietly used against me. Stay with me. This one takes some time to unfold properly. My mother left me the house when she died. 11 years ago, a modest 2-story place on a quiet street, the one I grew up in, the one where she'd raised me largely on her own after my father left when I was 9. In her will, she was specific about one thing. The house was to be titled solely in my name, not jointly with any future spouse, for your own security. The will's language said, in the careful, slightly formal way she wrote things when she meant them seriously. I understood, even then, that it wasn't really about distrust of anyone specific. It was about a woman who'd learned the hard way that having something entirely your own mattered. I met Owen 2 years after my mother died. We married 3 years after that. He knew, from the beginning, that the house was mine alone, and for most of our marriage, it never came up as an issue. We lived there together, split most other expenses jointly, and the fact that the deed had only my name on it felt like a minor technicality, rather than anything either of us thought about day to day. 7 years ago, I was in a serious car accident, nothing that left lasting damage, thankfully, but serious enough that I spent nearly 2 weeks in the hospital, several of those days barely lucid from medication and the aftermath of surgery. During that period, a hospital social worker suggested, gently, that it might be wise for Owen to have some legal authority to manage my affairs while I recovered, paying bills, handling insurance paperwork, that kind of thing. A notary came to my hospital room with a general durable power of attorney form. I remember signing it, barely, propped up on pillows, initialing where the notary pointed, trusting that whatever it authorized was exactly what the social worker had described. Bills. Insurance, the basic logistics of a life paused mid-recovery. I remember almost nothing else about that specific afternoon with any real clarity. The medication made most of that week blur together into a handful of disconnected images. I remember the notary's voice, calm and businesslike, walking me through each line. I remember Owen sitting in the chair beside the bed, signing his own portion of the form, thanking the notary, and later telling me, once I was more coherent, that he'd only asked for exactly what the social worker had suggested. Nothing more. I believed him completely, and for years I had no reason not to. I recovered fully within a few months. I never formally revoked that document, mostly because I forgot it existed at all. It sat, unused and unmentioned, in a file somewhere for 7 years, while our marriage continued in what I believed, for most of that time, was a normal, if occasionally strained, way. Farah told me later that this is unfortunately one of the most common ways these documents cause problems, not through malice at the time of signing, but through the simple human tendency to forget a piece of paper exists once the crisis that produced it has passed. The strain, in hindsight, had been building for longer than I wanted to admit at the time. Owen worked in commercial real estate, a field with unpredictable income, good years followed by lean ones, and over the past 2 years, the lean stretches had started outnumbering the good ones. He'd become increasingly focused on a woman named Bianca Sutherland, a chef he'd met through a client, whose ambition to open her own restaurant he talked about with an enthusiasm I noticed. Slowly, he no longer brought to anything involving our actual life together. I found out about the affair itself almost 8 months before the restaurant opened, not dramatically, just a pattern of late nights and vague explanations that eventually stopped making sense, even to someone trying hard to believe them. I confronted him. He admitted it. Apologized in the specific, practiced way people apologize when they've already decided not to actually stop, and asked for time to figure things out. I gave him that time, partly out of exhaustion, partly because ending an 11-year marriage isn't a decision you make in a single conversation, however clear the evidence is. There was a particular evening, a few weeks after that confrontation, when Owen tried to explain what he saw in Bianca, in a way that I think he genuinely believed was helpful. He said she made him feel like he was building something, in a way our marriage lately hadn't. I remember sitting across from him at our kitchen table, in the house my mother had left me, thinking about how strange it was to be told, by the person doing something with someone else, that I was somehow the reason he needed to feel that way in the first place. During those months, Owen talked more and more about Bianca's restaurant plans, the location she'd found, the equipment she needed, the gap in her financing she was struggling to close. I listened, mostly out of a kind of numb politeness, without registering how closely he was studying our own finances while he talked, or how carefully he'd started asking about the house's current market value, in conversations that seemed at the time unrelated. Looking back, I can point to at least 3 separate dinners where he asked, almost idly, what I thought the house might be worth now, compared to when my mother bought it. I answered honestly each time, having no idea what the question was actually in service of. There was a specific weekend, roughly 6 months before the opening, when Owen mentioned that Bianca had been turned down by 2 traditional small business lenders already, her restaurant concept deemed too niche, her personal credit history too thin after years working in other people's kitchens, rather than building her own financial record. He described the rejection with real sympathy, calling it unfair, the way talented people are so often overlooked by systems that reward paperwork over actual ability. I agreed with him generally about the unfairness of it, without any sense that the conversation was building toward anything beyond sympathy for someone I'd still, at that point, never met. 4 months before the opening, Owen moved out. Not fully, but enough that he was staying at an apartment to give us both space, a phrase that felt, even then, like the beginning of an ending, rather than a pause in the middle of one. I didn't fight the arrangement. I was tired, in a way that made distance feel like relief more than loss. What I didn't know during those months of separation that wasn't quite a separation was that Owen had gone looking through old paperwork at the house. During one of the visits we still occasionally had, ostensibly to collect some of his remaining belongings. He found the old power of attorney from the accident, still filed where it had always been, never formally revoked, technically still active under state law until I took the specific step of filing a revocation, something I'd simply never known I needed to do. He took it to a bank, not our joint bank, but a smaller regional lender he'd apparently researched carefully, and applied for a home equity loan against the house, presenting himself as my authorized agent under the power of attorney, requesting $340,000. The loan officer, reviewing the document, saw a notarized, seemingly valid power of attorney, and processed the application according to what appeared, on its face, to be standard procedure. The loan closed. The funds were disbursed. I found out none of this had happened until roughly a month later, when I noticed, almost by accident, a new lien recorded against my property, while doing an unrelated title search for a home insurance renewal. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with the title report open on my laptop, reading the lien amount twice, then a third time, certain I was misunderstanding something, I called the county recorder's office directly, half expecting to be told there'd been some kind of clerical mix-up, a lien mistakenly attached to the wrong parcel. The clerk read the recording back to me slowly, patiently, confirming the property address, the lien amount, and the name listed as the authorizing agent. It was Owen's name, exactly as I'd feared, attached to a power of attorney document dated 7 years earlier, a document I genuinely had to search my memory for several long seconds before I even placed what it was. After I hung up, I sat at that table for what felt like a very long time, not moving, going through the specific arithmetic of betrayal you do in moments like that, counting backward through months of conversations about the house's value, the affair I already knew about, the vague explanations for late nights, and realizing, piece by piece, that at least some portion of what I'd assumed was simple emotional distance had actually been active. Deliberate planning I'd had no visibility into at all. I didn't cry, not that afternoon. I remember being more curious than devastated, in a strange clinical way, wanting, more than anything, to understand exactly how he'd done it, before I let myself feel anything else about it. I didn't call Owen the moment I found the lien. I sat with the discovery for 2 full days, reading through the recorded document myself, then calling a title company to confirm exactly what had been filed and when. The lien listed Owen as acting under a power of attorney dated 7 years earlier, the accident document, the one I'd nearly forgotten entirely. I brought the actual power of attorney form, the original one I still had a copy of in my own files, to an attorney named Farah Delgado, a woman a coworker had recommended for exactly this kind of situation. Farah read through the document carefully, then pointed to a section near the bottom, a series of specific powers, each requiring a separate initial beside it to be activated, standard in our state for durable power of attorney forms, specifically to prevent exactly this kind of broad unintended use. Banking and bill payment, initialed. Insurance matters, initialed. Real estate transactions, including the power to mortgage, encumber, or otherwise transact on real property, not initialed. Left entirely blank, Farah explained that under state law, without that specific initialed authorization, the document simply didn't grant Owen the power to do what he'd done, regardless of what the loan officer had assumed when processing the paperwork. The lien, in other words, had been recorded based on an authority that had never actually existed. I asked her what that meant practically. She said it meant the lien was very likely voidable, but that proving it formally, through the bank's own legal process, would take time, and that acting too quickly before the restaurant had actually opened and drawn down the full loan might not produce the result I actually wanted. Farah asked me, directly, what result I actually did want. It was a fair question, and I didn't have a fully formed answer right away. Part of me wanted the money simply returned, the lien erased, and to move on as quietly as possible. Another part of me, one I didn't fully admit to Farah that first meeting, wanted the timing to matter. Wanted whatever correction happened to happen in a way that made the truth of it unavoidable, rather than something quietly fixed behind closed doors while Owen and Bianca continued believing the funding had been a real, generous gift. I didn't confront Owen. I didn't warn the bank yet. I let Farah begin quietly preparing the formal objection, and I waited, watching from a distance as Bianca's restaurant moved toward its opening. Funded by money that had never been properly authorized to leave my house in the first place. 6 weeks before the opening, Owen called me, his voice carrying an odd, hopeful cheerfulness I hadn't heard from him in months. He said he wanted me to come to the restaurant's opening night. Not as his date, he clarified quickly, but as someone who deserved to see it, given, he said, how much the house had helped make it possible. I asked him, carefully, what exactly he meant by that. He said something vague about using some of our shared resources smartly, a phrase that told me, more clearly than anything else could have, that he had no idea I already knew what he'd actually done, or that he assumed I'd simply never notice or never object even if I did. I told him I'd think about coming. I called Farah immediately afterward. She told me the objection was nearly ready to file, and asked whether I wanted to file it before the opening, which would likely halt the restaurant's remaining fund disbursement immediately. Or wait, since the lien's invalidity wouldn't disappear on its own, regardless of timing. I thought about it for a full day. I decided to attend the opening. I wanted more than I wanted to admit, even to myself, to see exactly what they'd built with it, once, before it came apart. That day of thinking involved more back and forth with myself than I expected. Part of me worried that attending would look, to anyone who eventually learned the full story, like I'd participated willingly in the celebration of something I already knew was built on a lie. I asked Farah directly whether my attendance could complicate the legal objection in any way. She assured me it wouldn't. The validity of the power of attorney had nothing to do with whether I chose to show up at a party afterward, and my presence or absence changed nothing about the underlying facts. That reassurance settled something in me, and I decided, finally, that I wanted to see it firsthand, rather than only imagine it from a distance. The restaurant, called Bianca's, on a corner storefront that had been an empty retail space for years, looked genuinely impressive the night it opened. Warm lighting, an open kitchen, 40 or so guests filling the space for a soft launch dinner before the public opening the following week. I came alone, in a plain navy dress, and stood near the bar, largely unnoticed among people who mostly didn't know who I was. Owen gave a short toast partway through the evening, thanking Bianca for her vision and her years of hard work, thanking the small group of investors and supporters who'd made the restaurant possible, and then, gesturing loosely in a direction that included me without ever actually saying my name, thanked some smart use of family resources for closing the final funding gap. A few guests glanced toward me, apparently aware, in the way small social circles often are, of exactly what and whom he meant. Bianca, standing beside him, smiled and raised her glass, thanking everyone who believed in this. In a tone that made clear she considered the funding entirely, uncomplicatedly earned. Nobody said the word house. Nobody said the word mortgage. Nobody said my name at all, actually, in connection with any of it. The entire arrangement had been built, deliberately or not, to let Owen accept quiet credit for generosity that was never his to offer, using an asset that had never been his to use. I finished my drink, congratulated Bianca, briefly and honestly, on the space itself, which genuinely was beautiful, and left before the toasts were fully finished. Standing outside afterward, waiting for a car to take me home, I found myself thinking less about anger and more about a strange, specific kind of clarity, the sense of having watched, from just outside the frame of a photograph, exactly what people will let themselves believe when believing it is convenient. Bianca had no reason to question where the money came from, beyond what Owen told her. Owen had every reason to make the story sound as generous and uncomplicated as possible. I was the only person in that room who understood, standing quietly by the bar with a drink I barely touched, that the entire warm, celebratory evening was built on a document that had never said what everyone assumed it said. Here is exactly what the power of attorney document said, in language I want you to hear plainly, because understanding it before the reveal is the entire point of this chapter. Under our state's statutory power of attorney form, certain categories of authority,
real estate transactions,
specifically among them, require a separate, individually initialed grant of power beside that specific category, distinct from the general signature on the document as a whole. This exists precisely to prevent someone from using a power of attorney intended for one narrow purpose, like managing bills during a medical recovery, to authorize something far broader and more consequential, like mortgaging a house. My original power of attorney, signed in that hospital bed 7 years earlier, had initials beside banking, bill payment, and insurance matters. The section for real estate transactions was blank. It had never been authorized, not because anyone made an error at the time, but because nobody, including the hospital's own notary, had any reason to think real estate authority would ever be relevant to a car accident recovery. When Owen presented the document to the bank as authorization for a home equity loan, the loan officer processing the application either didn't check the specific initialed sections carefully enough or assumed the general signature at the bottom covered everything listed above it, an assumption the document's own structure was specifically designed to prevent. Once Farah formally filed the objection, citing the missing initials under state statute, the bank's legal department had no real choice but to treat the lien as improperly recorded from the outset, because the power of attorney never actually authorized the transaction, the loan itself, while the money had genuinely been disbursed and spent, no longer had a valid lien securing it against my property, and the bank moved immediately to freeze any remaining undisbursed funds and recall what it could, treating the loan, procedurally, as though it had never been properly secured to begin with. Farah explained one more detail I found strangely comforting, in the way that clarity is comforting, even when the situation itself isn't. She said, the bank bore its own share of responsibility in this. Its own internal review process should have caught the missing initials before the loan closed, and its legal department knew this the moment the objection was filed, which was part of why they moved so quickly to correct the situation rather than fight it. Banks generally don't want a documented pattern of processing improperly authorized power of attorney transactions, she said, since it exposes them to exactly the kind of liability this situation represented. My case, from their perspective, wasn't really a dispute to litigate. It was an error to quietly and quickly unwind before it became a bigger problem for them. For the roughly 3 weeks between the opening and Farah's formal filing, I said almost nothing to anyone. I didn't tell Owen what I knew. I didn't tell Bianca anything at all. I'd only met her that one evening, briefly, and had no particular desire to explain myself to a woman who, as far as I could tell, genuinely believed her funding had been legitimately and generously given. I moved quietly into a small rental near my sister's place, not because I needed to escape anything physically dangerous, but because I needed distance from a house that increasingly felt like the setting for someone else's decisions, rather than my own life. I told my sister some of it, not all of it. She knew about the affair, knew I was consulting a lawyer about some paperwork issues, and didn't press for more, sensing correctly that I needed the quiet more than I needed to explain every detail out loud yet. There was one evening during those weeks when my sister, without knowing the full details, asked me if I was scared of what might happen once everything came out. I told her, honestly, that I wasn't scared so much as tired. Tired of being the only person in every version of this story who seemed to actually understand what had happened, while everyone else got to keep believing whatever version was easiest for them. She didn't have an answer for that, and I didn't need one. She just sat with me for a while, which, that particular week, was enough. I kept working during those weeks. Mostly out of necessity, I manage operations for a small architecture firm, and the routine of it, oddly, helped more than I expected. My coworkers knew, in general terms, that I was going through a difficult separation, though none of them knew the specifics of the loan or the legal objection, quietly moving forward in the background. There was a strange comfort in having a part of my life that remained entirely unaffected by any of it. A place where I was simply Renee, who managed schedules and vendor contracts competently, rather than the woman whose house had been used, without her knowledge, to fund her husband's affair. I thought, during those weeks, less about anger than about a strange, specific kind of vindication. I hadn't expected to feel this early. Not because I wanted the restaurant to fail, exactly, but because I wanted very badly for the story people eventually told about how it had opened to be the true one, rather than the version where Owen quietly and generously contributed family resources that were never his to give. Farah filed the formal objection on a Tuesday, citing the missing real estate authorization under state statute, requesting the lien be voided and any traceable remaining funds frozen. The bank's legal department responded within days, confirming, after their own review, that the power of attorney had never properly authorized the transaction and that the lien would be released as improperly recorded. Under the terms of the original loan agreement, once the security for the loan was voided, the bank moved to recall what funds it could and froze the restaurant's remaining line of credit immediately. The portion that had been earmarked for the second month of operating expenses. The certified letter arrived at the restaurant on a Saturday, during lunch service, exactly as my friend's video had shown me. Owen called me that afternoon, his voice cycling rapidly through confusion, then anger, then something closer to genuine panic, asking what I had done, whether I'd deliberately waited until the restaurant opened to sabotage it. I told him, as evenly as I could manage, that sabotage would have required me to interfere with something that had ever actually been his to use. I told him the document simply never authorized what he'd done with it, and that neither the bank's oversight in processing it nor his own assumptions about what it covered changed that fact. He called back twice more that evening, each time more agitated than the last. At one point, accusing me of somehow orchestrated the timing to maximize embarrassment for him and Bianca specifically. I told him, honestly, that the timing had been entirely the bank's own internal process, following statutory deadlines that had nothing to do with either of our schedules, and that if the timing felt cruel to him, he might consider that the underlying action, mortgaging a house that was never his, had been entirely his own choice from the very beginning, made long before I knew anything about any of it. Bianca, I learned afterward through a mutual acquaintance, was reportedly furious with Owen once she understood the funding had never been properly secured. Not at me, particularly, since she'd had no idea the house or the power of attorney were even involved, but at him for building the foundation of her restaurant on paperwork he'd apparently never bothered to have properly reviewed. The restaurant, scrambling for emergency short-term financing, managed to stay open in a reduced capacity, cutting staff and simplifying the menu significantly, though I've heard secondhand that it's struggling. Farah told me, once the release was formally recorded, that cases like this resolve far more often in the homeowner's favor than most people assume, precisely because the specific authorization requirement exists for exactly this reason: to prevent an old, forgotten document from being stretched into something it was never meant to cover. She said the hardest part usually isn't the law itself, which tends to be fairly clear on this point, but simply discovering the misuse had happened at all. Since these documents are designed to sit quietly, unnoticed, until someone decides to use them. The lien against my house was formally released 2 months after the objection was filed. The house is fully mine again, unencumbered, exactly as my mother intended when she wrote her will 11 years earlier, careful even then about a kind of protection I hadn't fully understood the value of, until I actually needed it. Owen and I are divorcing. It's not especially amicable, though it's also not the dramatic legal battle it might have been. The power of attorney issue, once resolved, actually simplified the divorce considerably, since there was never any real dispute about the house's ownership to begin with. He's moved in, I'm told, with Bianca more fully now, in an apartment above the restaurant, which strikes me as either a genuine commitment or simply the most convenient available option. And I've decided I don't need to know which. There was one conversation near the end of our divorce mediation where Owen tried, briefly, to explain his side of the loan, that he'd genuinely believed the old power of attorney covered real estate, that he'd never intended to deceive anyone, that in his mind he was simply helping someone he cared about, using resources he assumed were available to him. I told him I believed that he believed it, which was true, and also that believing something doesn't make it authorized. A distinction I suspect he still hasn't fully absorbed, given how much of his account of the whole situation still centers on his own good intentions, rather than what he actually did without asking. I don't feel triumphant about any of this, exactly. Though I won't pretend I felt nothing when I watched that video of the card machine going silent. Mostly I feel tired, in the specific way you feel after finally putting down something heavy you didn't realize you'd been carrying for years. Not just the marriage, but the quiet assumption that things given to me, protected for me, chosen carefully on my behalf by people who loved me, were somehow available for other people to use, however they decided was convenient. I filed the formal revocation of the old power of attorney the same week the lien was released. Something Farah walked me through carefully, making sure I understood exactly what it would and wouldn't affect going forward. It felt strange. Signing a document specifically to close a door I hadn't even known was still open for 7 years. Farah told me it's one of the more common pieces of advice she gives clients now. Almost as a footnote at the end of unrelated appointments, check the old documents, the ones signed during emergencies, the ones you assumed expired on their own once the crisis passed. Most of them don't expire. They just wait. What I kept in the end was the house, obviously, and also something smaller and harder to name. My mother wrote, in her will, that the house was mine for your own security. I understand now that she wasn't just talking about a roof. She was talking about the specific, quiet power of something being genuinely, legally, unambiguously yours, the kind of thing nobody can borrow, use, or hand away on your behalf, no matter how confidently they've convinced themselves, or anyone else, that they had the right to. If you've ever discovered someone had used something that was legally yours, without your knowledge, tell me, how did you find out, and what did you do? I read every comment, and I want to hear yours.